The invitation was supposed to be a joke. That was the part Ambassador Velthari Us would spend the rest of his life trying to explain. That no one on the Galactic Conclave's outreach committee had actually meant it. That the name had been added to the official delegation list as an act of inter-office mockery. That Councillor Dra of the Ethian Collective had laughed so hard his secondary breathing slits had gone into spasm when he first proposed it. Send the invitation to humanity, Dra had said, scrolling lazily through the list of uncontacted civilizations flagged as too primitive, too violent, or too unstable for first contact. Send it to the Deathworlders. See what happens. The room had erupted. The Ethians, the Sarathi, the ancient, slow-blinking Sithali who rarely laughed at anything, even they had let out their low, resonant hum of amusement, because the idea was absurd. The Galactic Conclave's Grand Assembly was the most prestigious political body in 7 star systems. Its annual summit of civilizations was attended only by species that had achieved certain benchmarks, sustained faster-than-light travel, a unified planetary government, at least 200 years without large-scale self-inflicted extinction events. Humanity had achieved exactly none of those things. They were a Class 4 developing civilization flagged under 3 separate Conclave watchdog designations: volatile, uncontrollable, and most damningly, Origin World Hazard Class Omega. Their planet, a dense high-gravity hyper-oxygenated rock orbiting dangerously close to a volatile yellow star, produced organisms that, by any reasonable biological standard, should not have been able to survive past childhood. Humans ran on a cocktail of adrenaline, stubbornness, and a biochemical pain response that, perversely, seemed to motivate them rather than discourage them. They had also, as of their most recent conflict assessment, been in some form of active war for approximately 93% of their recorded history. Sending them an invitation to the summit of civilizations was like handing a flame to a creature made of dry paper and calling it diplomacy. It was a joke. Councillor Dra filed the invitation anyway, a formal gold-sealed encrypted diplomatic transmission sent through the Conclave's official channel to the coordinates of a small blue-green world on the outer edge of the Orion Arm. He expected no response, or perhaps, if he was lucky, a confused and barely coherent reply from whatever primitive governmental body the humans were currently operating. Something to read aloud at the next committee meeting for a second round of laughs. What he got instead made the laughter stop completely. The 412th Summit of Civilizations opened on the first day of the Conclave's ceremonial calendar, with all the grandeur that 400 years of tradition could produce. The Grand Chamber of Aurum was vast, a tiered amphitheater carved from a single asteroid, its walls inlaid with the sigils of every member civilization, its central floor a mosaic of star maps depicting the 7 systems under Conclave governance. It seated 300 delegates. On this occasion, all 300 seats were filled, and a significant number of their occupants had quietly rearranged their schedules when word had spread through diplomatic back channels that the human delegate would be present. Nobody wanted to miss this. The general consensus, as best as it could be summarized across 6 species and multiple translator variants, was that the human would either be quietly absurd and quickly forgotten, or would commit some spectacular diplomatic breach that would be discussed for generations. Either way, worth watching. Dr. Mara Voss took her seat in the gallery reserved for observer civilizations, a polite architectural signal that humanity was present, but not yet a member, acknowledged but not equal. The chair was built for a Sithali delegate, which meant it was roughly 3 times wider than she needed, and featured an integrated nutrient misting function that she ignored. She had brought on a small handheld device what appeared to be written notes. The summit opened with the traditional recitation of the Compact, a 90-minute ceremonial reading of the founding principles of the Conclave, delivered in all 6 official languages, by 6 senior counselors in rotating order. It was the kind of proceedings that tested the patience of even veteran diplomats. Mara Voss listened to all 90 minutes without looking at her notes, without looking at her device and, as the delegate from the Sarathi would later recount in extensive detail, without once appearing bored. She watched each speaker with the focused attention of someone learning something, which was deeply unsettling to everyone who had expected her to be lost. The first formal session of the summit, was a debate on the outer expansion protocols, a long-running dispute between the Ythian Collective and the Sarathi Assembly over territorial rights in the unclaimed systems beyond the seventh star. It was a complex, decades-old argument involving 17 competing treaties, multiple resource claims, and a cultural grievance that dated back to a border incident most of the current delegates had not been alive for. Observer civilizations were not permitted to speak during formal sessions. This rule was, as far as anyone could recall, never broken. It lasted until the second hour of the outer expansion debate, when Councillor Dra-A, apparently still operating under the belief that the human's presence was more performance than threat, gestured toward the observer gallery with a magnanimous sweep of his tendrils and said, "Perhaps our new guest would like to share what a developing civilization thinks of territorial disputes? For educational purposes." The chamber tittered. Several delegates leaned forward. Voss looked up from her notes. "The Varith Clause," she said. Her voice carried without effort across the chamber's acoustics, calm, clear, and completely certain. Article 14, subsection 9 of the Third Expansion Accord, ratified 211 years ago. The Sarathi position on the outer systems is technically valid under current treaty law, but it relies on a clause that was inserted during the negotiations by a Sarathi junior minister who has since been tried and convicted by his own government for treaty fraud. The Ythian Collective's legal team is aware of this. They've chosen not to raise it because doing so would also invalidate the Pathera trade agreement, which benefits Ythia significantly. Both sides are negotiating in bad faith. They have been for 60 years. I can explain what a resolution might actually look like, if anyone is interested. The chamber was silent. Councillor Dra's tendrils had gone still. First Speaker Theris of the Sarathi, who had been in this debate for 26 years, turned slowly in her crystalline seat and looked at the human delegate with an expression that, through the cultural translator, registered as, "I knew it. I knew this would happen." It was Grand Arbiter Mensol, the eldest of the Sithali, who had presided over 4 summits and was not given to drama, who finally spoke. "Ambassador Voss," said Mensol, in a voice like tectonic plates settling, "you are currently seated in the observer gallery." "I am," Voss agreed. "Observer civilizations do not have the floor." "I know. And yet you spoke." "Councillor Dra invited me to." She glanced across the chamber at Dra, who appeared to be attempting to become structurally invisible. "I was being polite." Mensol regarded her for a long moment. The Sithali's slow blinking eyes, each one the size of a dinner plate, moved over Voss with the deliberate patience of a creature that measured time in centuries. "You have read the full treaty archive," Mensol said. It was not a question. "The accessible portions," Voss said. "There are approximately 2,000 documents in the restricted archive that your public diplomatic records reference but don't publish. I made some educated guesses about those." Educated guesses. Based on the patterns in the documents I could access, cross-referenced with the voting records of the relevant parties and the economic data from the disputed systems. I was probably wrong about some of them. What percentage do you estimate you were wrong about? Voss considered this with the straightforward thoughtfulness of someone doing a quick mental calculation. 17%, she said. Maybe 20. Which meant she was right about 80% of a classified archive she had never seen. The Grand Arbiter looked at her for another long moment. Then Mensol did something that none of the 300 delegates present had ever seen the Grand Arbiter do in 34 years of presiding over summits. She offered the floor. "Ambassador Voss of Earth," said Mensol, "the Grand Chamber will hear your proposal." What followed over the next 6 hours would later be referred to, in conclave historical records, as the Voss Sessions, a name that was accurate if profoundly understated, like calling a tidal wave the Voss wave event because technically, that was what it was. Mara Voss did not shout. She did not threaten. She did not perform. She simply talked, in the measured, precise tone of someone who had spent a significant portion of her life studying exactly this problem and had run out of patience for the ways powerful institutions avoided solving it. She dismantled the outer expansion dispute in 40 minutes, walking both sides through the legal architecture of their own positions until the fraudulent clause was exposed in full view of every delegate, and then immediately offering a restructured framework that preserved core Wythian trade interests while genuinely addressing the Sarathi territorial concerns. It was not a perfect solution. She said so explicitly. It was a functional one, which was something 6 decades of summit negotiations had failed to produce. She then, without being asked, turned to the secondary agenda. The Drift Cluster humanitarian question. A slow-burning crisis involving the unaffiliated, non-member civilizations on the conclave's outer edges, species too small or too resource-poor to meet membership thresholds, effectively abandoned by the same body that claimed to represent all sentient life in the region. This was the item that never made it past the first hour of any summit session, because none of the member civilizations had any direct economic incentive to address it. Voss addressed it. "You have a word for this," she said, looking around the chamber. "In your diplomatic language you call it peripheral consideration. We have a different word for it on Earth. We call it abandonment. And we've been doing it to each other since before we had language to name it. I'd like to think you might do better." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. First speaker Theris of the Sarathi, who had spent 26 years opposing every proposal this chamber had ever made, who had been present at 11 summits and been moved by exactly none of them, looked at the human delegate with her slow, crystalline eyes and said quietly, "What do you propose?" The summit recessed at the end of the first day with more achieved than had been accomplished in the previous 4 sessions combined. This was not, in itself, the catastrophic backfire. The catastrophic backfire came on the morning of the second day, when Sub-Counselor Veen, who had by this point progressed through humiliation, anger, and a defensive form of professional jealousy, made the decision to launch what he privately called a re-establishment of context. What he publicly called it was a security briefing. "The chamber should be made aware," said Veen, standing at the central floor with the stiff posture of someone executing a plan he had told himself was reasonable, "that the civilization currently represented in our observer gallery carries several significant risk designations in our xenobiological registry." He activated the chamber's projection system. Earth's file appeared. Conclave surveillance data compiled over 40 years of covert observation, the wars, the weapons, the sheer catalog of violence that humanity had produced in its short, ferocious history. The nuclear tests, the chemical weapons stockpiles, the casualty figures from conflicts that had ended and the ones that hadn't, biological hazard assessments, atmospheric toxicity reports from weapons testing sites, a footnote on the human immune system that described it as effectively waging constant internal warfare against thousands of simultaneous microbial invasions. Veen presented it all with the careful framing of someone who thought they were revealing something damning. The chamber watched. And then something happened that Veen had not prepared for. Mara Voss watched too. She watched the entire presentation without expression. She did not protest or defend or attempt to minimize. She let Veen run through every piece of data, every conflict, every weapon system, every piece of evidence that humanity was exactly what the files said it was: volatile, violent, and relentlessly, exhaustingly dangerous. When Veen finished, the chamber turned to look at her. She stood up. "Everything in that file is accurate," she said. Veen blinked. "We have fought wars for territory, resources, ideology, religion, and spite," Voss continued. "We have developed weapons capable of ending all life on our planet, and we came disturbingly close to using them on more than one occasion. Our history is, by almost any measurable standard, a record of what happens when a highly intelligent, highly aggressive species is given tools before it's developed the wisdom to use them responsibly. I'm not going to argue with any of that." The chamber was very quiet. "What I will tell you," she said, "is what that file doesn't contain." She reached into her jacket and produced a small data chip, which she held up briefly before walking to the chamber's data interface and inserting it without asking permission. A new projection appeared, Not weapons. Not casualty reports. Not toxicity assessments. It was a graph. Multivariable, spanning 200 years with dozens of overlapping trend lines, and every single one of them across 2 centuries of data was moving in the same direction. Down. War fatalities as a percentage of global population, Voss said. Down 87% over 200 years. Child mortality, down 91%. Extreme poverty by any measurable standard, down from 40% of our global population to under 9. Life expectancy, up 40 years in 2 centuries. Literacy. Global literacy in 1820 was approximately 12%. As of this year, it is 96. We are still violent. We are still dangerous. We still have weapons we should not have, and conflicts we have not resolved. I am not standing here to tell you that humanity is good. I am standing here to tell you that humanity is improving. And we are improving faster than any species in this chamber's history improved at our developmental stage. Faster, in fact, than several of your current member civilizations were improving when they applied for conclave membership. She turned to look directly at the Sarathi delegation. The Sarathi were admitted to the conclave 312 years ago. At the time of their admission, they were 40 years removed from the crystalline purges, a series of internal conflicts that resulted in the destruction of approximately 30% of their civilian population. The conclave admitted them anyway, because the trajectory mattered more than the history. She turned to the Ethians. The Ethian collective achieved unified planetary government 61 years before their admission application. Earth achieved unified planetary government 9 years ago. We are moving faster. Not because we are better. Because we had the advantage of watching you, watching all of you, and understanding what was possible. She pulled the data chip from the interface. The projection disappeared. We have known about the conclave for 40 years. We have been watching your sessions, translating your broadcasts, building models of your political structures, and learning your languages, all 6 official ones, plus several unofficial ones that your own diplomats pretend not to speak in formal settings. We did not reach out because we were not ready. We are reaching out now because we are, and because you sent the invitation. She sat down. The chamber was silent for a very long time. It was First Speaker Tharis of the Sarathi who spoke first, the same delegate who had warned 3 days ago that this was going to go wrong, who had the most institutional authority to say, "I told you so," and choose instead to say something else. The Sarathi crystalline purges. Tharis said slowly. You knew the figures. Yes. That data is sealed in the conclave's restricted archive. I know. I told you I made educated guesses. I was probably right about more than 80%. Tharis made a sound that the cultural translator rendered, after a moment's processing delay, as a very dry laugh. Ambassador Voss, said Grand Arbiter Mensal from the presiding seat, I would like to ask you a direct question. Please. Why did you come? Not Earth. You. There are approximately 9 billion humans on your planet. The diplomatic corps chose you. Why? Voss considered this with the same direct honesty she had applied to everything else. Because I'm the best at this, she said. And because I have a low tolerance for rooms full of powerful people avoiding hard problems. And you believe the conclave is such a room? I believe every room with power in it has that tendency, including rooms on Earth, including rooms I've been in. The size of the room doesn't change the problem. It just changes the scale of what gets avoided. Mensal was quiet for a moment. The observer designation carries a standard review period of 50 years before membership consideration. I know. There is a provision in the original compact, Article 3, I believe you may already be aware, for an accelerated review in cases of extraordinary diplomatic contribution. Voss was still. Her expression didn't change. But something in the room seemed to shift, as though the air pressure had altered slightly. I'm aware of Article 3, she said. The Sarathi, said Tharis, would be willing to second a motion for accelerated review. As would the Sathali, said Cultural Liaison Sieri, who had not spoken since the docking bay, and appeared to have spent the intervening time deeply regretting the section of her paper that Voss had critiqued. Veen opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, said nothing. The accelerated review passed. It was not a unanimous vote. Nothing in the conclave ever was. There were 8 dissenting votes, all from smaller member civilizations who feared, not unreasonably, that admitting a species with 9 billion individuals, a class Omega homeworld, and a demonstrated capacity for outreading a classified archive on first contact was going to change the conclave's internal dynamics in ways they could not fully predict. They were right. It was going to change everything. The formal admission process took 18 months, a blink, by conclave standards. During those 18 months, Mara Voss remained on Conclave Station Aurum as Earth's provisional representative, operating officially in an advisory capacity that everyone understood was not advisory in any meaningful sense. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She did not, as several member delegations had privately braced for, attempt to dismantle anything. She asked questions. She asked them constantly, relentlessly, with a focused precision that was initially mistaken for interrogation and eventually understood to be something more like architecture. She was building something in her head, layer by layer. And the questions were the material. The Sithali Grand Archivist, a creature who had been alive for 400 years and had spoken to perhaps 12 individuals in all that time, began voluntarily seeking out her company. The Sarathi first speaker took to including her in pre-session briefings as a matter of course. Even Velthari Us, the protocol ambassador who had felt so thoroughly assessed in the docking bay, found himself consulting her on matters that were technically outside her provisional brief. She was, in some way that none of them had language for yet, useful, not in the transactional way that conclave politics defined usefulness, but in the way a structural element is useful, quietly load-bearing, easy to underestimate until it's gone. Councillor Dra resigned from the outreach committee 6 weeks after the summit. He cited personal reasons. Sub-Councillor Veen did not resign. He remained in his seat for the full duration of the admission process, attending every session, saying very little, and carrying himself with the careful dignity of a person who has understood, fully and permanently, that he has made a significant error and intends to spend the remainder of his career not compounding it. It was, in the private assessment of several colleagues, the most graceful thing he had ever done. On the day of Earth's formal admission to the Galactic Conclave, a gray November morning by Earth's calendar, celebrated on the station with a ceremony that Voss had politely declined to have named after her, Grand Arbiter Mensol summoned her to the presiding chamber before the official proceedings began. The Grand Arbiter was old, older than the station, older than the version of the compact that now included Earth in its signatories. She sat in the center of the empty chamber with the patient stillness of something that has watched long enough to know that most things people worry about are temporary. "The invitation," said Mensol. Voss stood at the chamber floor and looked up. "What about it? When you received it, when your diplomatic corps decoded the transmission and understood what it was, did you know it was not genuine?" Voss considered this for a moment. "We suspected it wasn't a standard first contact protocol. The phrasing was inconsistent with what we'd observed of conclave communications, and the timing was convenient in a way that suggested opportunism rather than policy. You came anyway." "Yes." "Why?" Voss looked up at the vaulted ceiling again, the bioluminescent architecture, the star maps, the 400 years of wait. "Because a door is a door," she said. "It doesn't matter why it opened." Menzel regarded her with those enormous, slow eyes. "The Sarathi were right," the Grand Arbiter said finally. "When this invitation was sent, First Speaker Theris argued against it on the grounds that contact with your species was premature and potentially destabilizing. She told me. She now argues that Earth's admission is the most significant event in the Conclave's history since the founding. She told me that too. Which do you believe is accurate?" Voss thought about this with the same direct, unperformative honesty that she applied to everything. "Both," she said. "It was premature. We weren't ready, not really. I was ready, but 9 billion people aren't ready just because their best diplomat is. It was also the most significant thing to happen here in a very long time. Both things can be true. Mensol was quiet. One more question, the Grand Arbiter said. Of course. The postscript, in your original response to the invitation, we were waiting to see if you were worth talking to. Have you decided? Mara Voss looked around the empty chamber, the sigils on the walls, the mosaics of star systems, the seats of 300 civilizations that had, over 400 years, built something that was imperfect and slow and frequently frustrating and still, stubbornly, trying. She smiled. Yes, she said, provisionally. Mensol made a sound that the translator rendered, after a delay, as laughter, slow and deep and rich with 4 centuries of perspective. Provisionally, the Grand Arbiter repeated. That is honest. We're working on it, Voss said. Both of us. The admission ceremony was brief, by conclave standards. Earth's sigil was added to the chamber wall. A small blue-green circle, placed in the lower right quadrant where new members always went, with plenty of room above it, as the years accumulated and the record grew. Mara Voss stood at the central floor and accepted the formal welcome from Grand Arbiter Mensol and the assembled delegates of 6 civilizations, 300 chairs, and 400 years of history. She did not cry. She did not make a long speech. She said, "Thank you. We'll try not to break anything." The laughter that followed was, for the first time since her arrival, entirely genuine. All 300 delegates, 6 species, every translator variant finding the same thing in those 5 words. Not the performance of confidence, not the display of power, not the show of competence that had dominated every moment since she'd stepped off a scratched-up ship held together with rubber and audacity. Just a person, standing in an enormous room, doing her best, which was, it turned out, more than enough. Somewhere in the diplomatic archive of Conclave Station Aurum, in a file that would eventually be studied by historians of 4 species and quoted in a dozen academic papers on first contact theory, was a brief internal memo from Protocol Ambassador Velthari Us, written on the evening of the first day of the 412th summit, addressed to no one in particular, which read, "The invitation was supposed to be a joke. For future reference, the next time we consider sending a message to a species we've flagged as dangerous, volatile, and impossible to predict, perhaps consider the possibility that those words describe something that is difficult, not something that is less. There is a difference. I understand it now. I suspect I will spend some time thinking about how long it took me to learn it." Below that, in the margin, in a different hand, smaller, neater, the handwriting of someone who had been using the Protocol Ambassador's office to review files, was a single additional line. Good start. It began with a ring, not a sound, not a signal. A physical ring. 2,000 warships arranged in a perfect sphere around the entire solar system, 300 million kilometers from the sun, positioned with such geometric precision that the distance between each vessel was identical to within 3 meters. A ring of fire and metal and absolute authority, stretching from inside Mercury's orbit to beyond the Kuiper belt. A cage built around an entire civilization. The Galactic Compact called it a containment measure. Everyone else called it what it was, a blockade. It had never been done before, not at this scale. Smaller blockades had been used against individual colony worlds, single stations, wayward freighters. But enclosing an entire home system, an entire species, inside a military cordon that spanned hundreds of millions of kilometers, that was new. That was deliberate. That was the Galactic Compact sending a message not just to humanity, but to every species watching from the safe distance of their own star systems. This is what we can do, remember that. The stated reason was the Santiago incident, a human deep exploration vessel that had 7 months earlier crossed into a region of space the compact had designated a protected observation zone without authorization. The crew had not known. The designation had been made 14 days before their crossing, communicated through diplomatic channels that humanity's compact liaison had not yet processed. A clerical failure, a genuine, documented, provable clerical failure, for which the human government had formally apologized 4 times. The compact had accepted the apology, and then blockaded the solar system anyway, because the Santiago incident was not the reason. The reason, the real reason, understood by every diplomat and military analyst and back-channel negotiator in the galaxy, was the Battle of the Kepler Zone, 8 months earlier. The battle that had never been supposed to happen, in which humanity had dismantled a Velthari pacification fleet with a precision and ferocity that had rewritten every galactic assessment of human military capability, and more dangerously, given other species ideas. The blockade was not punishment for a navigation error. The blockade was a message. We cannot erase what happened, but we can remind you, and everyone watching, who holds the walls. Rear Admiral Cassiel Morrow learned about the blockade the way most people learned about it, not through official channels, but through the sudden, complete absence of outgoing ships. She was commanding the supply convoy Meridian Run, 14 freighters carrying medical equipment, seed stock, and construction materials bound for the outer colonies. When every fold drive in the convoy simultaneously received an override lockout code she had never seen before. Emergency stop all drives. Authorization Galactic Compact Enforcement Division. She stood on the bridge of the convoy escort CSS Arrowhead and stared at the code for a long moment. Then she pulled up the long-range sensor array and looked outward, past Neptune, past the Kuiper Belt, into the deep dark where the numbers said 2,000 ships were sitting. She was a small woman, Cassiel Morrow, compact in build with a face that looked younger than her 47 years and eyes that looked considerably older. She had been born on a station in the asteroid belt. She had never in her life lived on a planet. She had a sister on Ganymede, a brother on the colony world of Proxima Station, and a convoy that was now sitting dead in space because someone had decided that 14 freighters carrying medical equipment were a threat to galactic order. She turned to her communications officer. "Get me UEDC command." "The blockade is—" He stopped, started again. "Admiral, the blockade is jamming long-range communications. We're receiving compact frequencies only." "Then get me the nearest relay buoy." "Jammed." "Short-range ship-to-ship?" "Still operational, within the system only." She absorbed this. "So we can talk to each other. We just can't talk to anyone outside." "Yes, ma'am." She turned back to the sensor display. 2,000 ships. A perfect sphere. Beyond it, the outer colonies, 14 of them, that had been receiving supply convoys on a 17-day rotation cycle. Medical equipment, food supplements, atmospheric processors for the new settlements. Things that people needed, things that had a clock on them. She pulled up the supply inventory for each colony. She ran the numbers. She did it twice because the first time she thought she had made an error. She hadn't. At current consumption rates, with no resupply, Proxima Station, her brother's station, had 91 days of food reserves. The 3 youngest colonies, still in early terraforming phases and heavily dependent on supply lines, had less. 40 days. Maybe 50 if they rationed hard. The compact's containment measure had no stated end date. Morrow closed the inventory screen and was quiet for a very long time. Then she opened a new file and started writing. Not a report, not a formal complaint, not a diplomatic request, a plan. 3 days into the blockade, the compact's senior enforcement commander transmitted a message to UEDC headquarters. Admiral Throne Vath, a Kilvari, a species whose physical form resembled something between an architectural column and a weather system, spoke in measured, almost courteous tones. He expressed confidence that the containment period would be brief. He outlined the conditions for its lifting, a comprehensive review of human navigation protocols, submission of all exploration vessel flight plans for prior compact approval, and, buried in paragraph 11 of a 17-paragraph document, a formal acknowledgement that the Battle of the Kepler Zone had constituted an unauthorized military action, for which humanity accepted full compact jurisdiction. That last condition was the actual point. If humanity signed it, they were not just acknowledging a navigation error. They were retroactively criminalizing their own self-defense. They were telling every species in the galaxy that the compact had the right to dictate when a civilization was and was not allowed to protect itself. Secretary General Diallo read the document 3 times. Then she called her senior legal counsel, her military advisors, and Admiral Park, who was 3 systems away, and whose voice on the secure channel carried the particular flatness of someone measuring their words very carefully. "They're not going to lift it," Park said. "Not in 40 days, maybe not in 400. The third condition is designed to be unacceptable. They want us to either sign it, which breaks us politically, or refuse it, which lets them keep the blockade running indefinitely while claiming we're the obstacle to resolution." "And the colonies?" Diallo asked. A pause. 40 days. Another pause. "Cassiel Morrow filed a report," Park said. "You should read it." Diallo pulled it up while he was still on the line. She read it once fast, then again slowly. Then she was quiet for a moment. "This is insane," she said. It was not a criticism, it was an assessment. "Yes," Park said. "It might also be the only thing that works." No blockade in galactic history had ever been broken. This was not merely a statistic. It was a foundational assumption of compact military doctrine, the reason that blockades had become the preferred tool of coercion against species that were too visible to simply attack and too inconvenient to ignore. The logic was geometric and total. Enough ships positioned correctly covered every possible exit vector. Fold drives required a minimum charge time of 11 minutes, during which the vessel's location was precisely detectable. Any ship attempting a fold jump from inside a blockade sphere was simply a target that helpfully announced its own coordinates 11 minutes in advance. The doctrine had held for 2 centuries. No one had broken it because no one had found a way around the 11-minute problem. Morrow's plan was based on the premise that the 11-minute problem was not, in fact, the actual problem. She had written 47 pages. Her communications officer, Lieutenant Priya Dinesh, had read all 47 pages in one sitting and then spent 20 minutes completely silent before saying, "You know this is either the most brilliant thing I've ever read or it's going to get us all killed." "Probably both," Morrow had said. The plan had 3 fundamental insights, each one building on the last. The first insight was about what a blockade actually guarded against. Compact blockade doctrine was designed to prevent organized military breakouts, large ships, military-grade fold drives, coordinated jumps. The 2,000 vessels were positioned and armed to intercept exactly that. Anything big, anything fast, anything that looked like a threat. What the doctrine was not specifically designed for, because no one had ever needed to specifically design against it, was the complete opposite. Slow, small, invisible. Not invisible in the stealth technology sense. Invisible in the sense of not registering as a meaningful threat. Invisible in the way that background noise is invisible to a sensor calibrated to detect signals. The second insight was about the construction capacity that humanity had been quietly developing in the asteroid belt for 30 years. Not military construction, industrial. The kind of unglamorous, massive-scale infrastructure building that no compact intelligence assessment had bothered to deeply analyze because it wasn't weapons, it wasn't ships, it wasn't interesting. Morrow had a complete inventory. She had requested it the night she wrote the plan, citing supply logistics as justification, which was technically true. What the inventory showed was something that made her sit very still for a while. Humanity had, in the asteroid belt, the capacity to build a lot of things very quickly. The third insight was the strangest one, and the one that had kept Dinesh silent for 20 minutes. It was about how blockade enforcement worked at the operational level, specifically about what 2,000 ships crewing 600 people each were actually doing moment to moment during a containment operation that was intended to last months. They were watching, monitoring, running sensor sweeps, processing an enormous quantity of data about a solar system that contained, nominally, the entire human civilian and military apparatus. They were looking at a lot, which meant they were filtering a lot. which meant there was a threshold, a noise floor, below which a signal was processed as irrelevant and dismissed. Morrow had done some calculations about what that noise floor was. She had then done some calculations about what humanity could do that stayed below it. When she briefed Admiral Park, she used a phrase that he later said he had been thinking about for weeks, without quite being able to articulate. "The blockade is a wall," she said. "We're not going to go through it, we're not going to go over it, we're going to go under it, and we're going to do it in a way that they won't realize is happening until it's already done." Park had been quiet for a moment. "How many ships?" "Not ships," Morrow said. "Pods." The fabrication order went out through short-range relay, the only communication channel still open within the blockaded system. It was disguised, at Morrow's insistence, as a routine asteroid mining equipment requisition. This was not difficult to disguise because it was technically what it was. The fabrication plants in the belt were already producing extraction pods, small, automated, unpiloted units designed to be fired at asteroid surfaces, latch on, drill, collect, and return. They were manufactured by the thousands. They were boring. They were part of the background noise of a civilization going about its industrial business, which was exactly what the Compact's sensor teams were processing them as. What changed was their interior configuration. In their standard form, extraction pods carried drilling equipment and collection containers. The modified form, specifications transmitted in 3 separate pieces through 3 separate supply logistics channels, assembled by the fabrication AI without any single channel having the complete picture, carried something different. The drilling equipment was replaced with a compressed cargo section, sealed and thermally stabilized. The collection container was replaced with a navigation package, not a full drive, nothing that required an 11-minute charge-up, nothing that registered as a jump signature, a conventional thruster array, very small, very slow, designed to operate at low enough power output that its thermal signature was indistinguishable from background solar radiation at any distance beyond 400 kilometers. Each pod could carry approximately 300 kilograms of sealed cargo. Each pod, once it cleared the inner system under the cover of normal mining operations, would take approximately 11 days to reach the blockade perimeter at minimal signature thrust. 11 days. Moving slowly, quietly as part of a background that 2,000 warships were already in the habit of ignoring. Not jumping, not announcing, just moving. The way that objects in space had always moved before fold drives existed. The way that nobody moved anymore because it was too slow to matter, unless you were planning ahead. Unless you had thought about it quietly in the back of your mind for 30 years. Unless you had built an industrial infrastructure in the asteroid belt that could produce 10,000 small objects per week, and unless those objects were already so ubiquitous in the sensor data of every ship watching you that they registered as noise. The first batch of pods was authorized and began fabrication 6 days into the blockade. By day 10, the first wave of 3,000 was processing through normal mining dispatch channels, logged, cataloged, moving outward through the system on vectors that the Compact's Enforcement Division reviewed and dismissed in automated batch processing. The cargo in those pods: medical supplies, concentrated nutrition packs, atmospheric processor components, seeds, water purification elements. Everything the colonies needed. Nothing that looked like a weapon. Nothing that looked like a breakout attempt. Just supplies, moving very slowly through space in very small containers, below the threshold of what a blockade designed to stop warships was calibrated to consider meaningful. On the Compact flagship Unyielding Authority, Admiral Thronevoth received his daily operational briefing at precisely the scheduled hour. Sensor sweeps, nominal. Human military movements, none. Communication traffic within the system, reduced, consistent with a population under communication lockdown. Fold drive activation signatures, 0. His intelligence officer mentioned, briefly, an uptick in asteroid belt extraction pod deployment. Standard industrial activity, automated systems, fully consistent with normal human mining operations. It had been reviewed. Nothing of concern. Thronevoth acknowledged the briefing and moved on. In the outer system, 3,000 small objects moved through the dark. Rear Admiral Morrow spent the 11 days doing what she had always done best: logistics. Not the glamorous kind. Not the kind that appeared in military histories. The kind that required sitting in front of a spreadsheet at 0200 hours and working out whether pod batch 17 had the correct nutrient density to cover the caloric shortfall in Proxima Station's rationing protocol, while also accounting for the 3% spoilage rate in the atmospheric processor components if transit temperature dropped below -40. She slept 4 hours a night. Danesh, who had become effectively her chief of staff, slept slightly less. The convoy crews, 14 ships sitting useless in the inner system, their full drives locked, had been repurposed into a logistics coordination cell, each ship's crew assigned to specific colonies, specific supply calculations, specific pod batch manifests. They were very good at it. Freighter crews were always good at logistics. That was the job. On day 4, she received a transmission from her brother on Proxima Station. It was short. He knew she would be busy. He said, "I don't know what's happening out there, but I know you. Whatever you're doing, be careful." She flagged the message. She would answer it later. She went back to the spreadsheet. On day 6, the first signs of stress appeared in the outer colonies. Proxima Station's governor, a woman named Lena Osei, who had been running the station for 12 years and had, in Morrow's assessment, the operational toughness of someone who had spent a decade keeping 4,000 people alive in deep space, transmitted a status report that was factual, calm, and contained exactly one sentence that Morrow read 3 times. "We have begun implementing emergency rationing protocols as of today. Morale is holding. We know someone is working on it." Morrow read that last sentence. She did not let herself feel anything about it until she was alone, and then she allowed herself approximately 90 seconds of a feeling she couldn't quite name. Something between the weight of responsibility and the thing that sits underneath it when you know you are carrying it for people who trust you. And then she set it aside and went back to work. On day 8, a problem emerged. One of the compact's outer patrol groups, 12 frigates stationed near the Kuiper Belt perimeter, closer to the exit vectors, had modified their sensor sweep pattern. Not significantly. A 3-degree rotation in their coverage arc, likely a standard procedure adjustment. But the rotation created a narrow overlap zone where the resolution of 2 ships' sensor packages combined in a way that slightly exceeded the background noise threshold that Morrow had calculated. Pod Batch 11, which was already 40% of the way to the perimeter, was transiting through that zone. Danesh flagged it at 0340 hours. Morrow was asleep. Danesh woke her anyway. They had 40 minutes before Batch 11 entered the overlap zone. Morrow looked at the problem for 30 seconds. Reroute the batch, 2-degree yaw adjustment, reduce thrust to 60%. It'll extend their transit time by 19 hours. That pushes Proxima Station's supply arrival past. I know. Recalculate the rationing protocol. We find 19 hours somewhere. She was already pulling up the spreadsheet. What else? Batch 19 is still on schedule. No issues. Batch 19 carries the atmospheric processors. Yes, ma'am. Good. She was quiet for a moment, working through the numbers. Get me the governor of New Perth Colony. I need to know their exact current reserves, not the filed estimate. Exact. Danesh looked at her. It's 400. I know. I'll get her. The problem with Batch 11 was resolved. The 19-hour delay was absorbed through a rationing adjustment that Morrow worked out with Governor Osei's logistics team over the following 2 hours. It was not comfortable math. It required asking people who were already rationing to ration slightly harder. Osei agreed without complaint, and with the particular economy of words that Morrow had come to understand as the signature of someone who had long ago made peace with hard choices. On day 9, Morrow received a transmission from UEDC Command through the encrypted short-range relay network. A message bounced from ship to ship across the inner system in segments, reassembled at the endpoint, time delayed, but intact. It was from Secretary General Diallo. It read, "We are aware of what you're doing. We have not officially sanctioned it. We will not officially deny it. Do what needs doing." AD Morrow read it once, nodded, and filed it. On day 10, Pod Batch 1 reached the outer edge of the blockade sphere. This was the part of the plan that had no historical precedent. Not because no one had ever thought of it. Somewhere, at some point, someone had probably run the theoretical math on low-signature transit as a blockade evasion technique. But because it had never been operationally feasible. You needed thousands of small units which required massive fabrication capacity. You needed 11 days of transit time without detection, which required the background noise camouflage of a long-established industrial operation. You needed precise navigation packages in unpiloted pods, which required an automation technology base that had only reached operational reliability in the last decade. You needed, in other words, exactly the combination of industrial, navigational, and logistical development that humanity had quietly assembled over 30 years while the galaxy watched its military capacity and assumed that was all that mattered. The pods didn't stop at the blockade perimeter. They didn't need to. There was no physical barrier, just ships and sensors, and the assumption that anything worth stopping would announce itself. Batch 1 passed through the gaps between compact warships at distances ranging from 900 to 4,000 kilometers, moving slowly, quietly, their thermal signatures folded into the vast background of solar radiation and cosmic noise. Not one of them was detected. At the compact flagship, the automated sensor processing system logged 17,000 discrete objects in the Kuiper Belt transit zone that day. It flagged 0 of them as anomalous. The batch processing algorithm that reviewed objects under 2 meters in diameter, moving below 15 meters per second, with thermal signatures within 2 standard deviations of ambient, which described every single one of Morrow's pods perfectly, dismissed them without human review. 3,000 supplies pods crossed the most powerful blockade in galactic history. They didn't break it. They ignored it. And 2 days later, the first of them arrived at Proxima Station. Governor Osei was in the station's operations center when the proximity alert sounded. Not the emergency klaxon, the soft chime of an inbound object. Non-threatening. Small. Something the automated system had flagged for human review because it was on an approach vector but too small to be a ship. Her operations officer pulled up the sensor data, looked at it again. Governor, it's an asteroid extraction pod. From where? From the inner system. It's been traveling for... He checked the trajectory calculation. 11 days. Osei looked at the screen, at the small, unassuming object approaching her station, at the thermal signature that matched a standard extraction pod perfectly, at the navigation package that had guided it, alone, across 4 billion kilometers of empty space, without a single course correction error. "Open it," she said. The pod's cargo seal released. Inside, medical supplies, concentrated nutrition, atmospheric processor components, wrapped carefully, sealed against temperature variance, enough to cover 2 weeks of the station's current shortfall. 1 pod. There were 3,000 more inbound. Osei stood at the operations window and looked out at the stars for a long moment. Her operations officer was quiet beside her, because he was smart enough to know when someone needed a moment. When she turned back, her eyes were dry. Her expression was entirely composed. Her voice was steady. "Get me a receiving schedule," she said. "I want every pod cataloged and distributed within 6 hours of arrival, and someone get me a line to Rear Admiral Morrow. Communication lockdown. We'll bounce it. Find a way." The way was found. The transmission took 9 hours to reach Morrow through the relay network, arriving in fragments, reassembled by the Arrowhead's communication system at 0200 hours on day 14 of the blockade. It said, "Supplies received, station secure. Whatever you did, it worked. Tell me how." Morrow read it. She was sitting at her desk, the spreadsheet still open, the next 12 batches already in progress. The data in front of her said that at current production rate, she could sustain the supply schedule indefinitely. Not comfortably, not without difficulty, but sustainably. The colonies would not starve. The atmospheric processors would not fail. The people on Proxima Station and New Perth and the 11 other outer settlements would have what they needed. The blockade was still there. 2,000 ships, perfect sphere, 300 million kilometers in every direction. It had not moved. It had not been defeated. No military force had challenged it. It had simply been made irrelevant. It was not Morrow who told the galaxy. It was the compact. On day 22 of the blockade, a routine intelligence review on the unyielding authority flagged an anomaly. Not in sensor data, the pods were still passing through undetected, but in a commercial shipping manifest from Proxima Station that had been transmitted on a compact-monitored short-range frequency. The manifest listed incoming cargo received over the previous 8 days. The cargo types were consistent with resupply. The origin code on the manifest referenced inter-system fabrication facilities. The intelligence officer who reviewed it sat with it for an hour before escalating. He was not a slow thinker. He was a thorough one. He wanted to make sure he understood what he was looking at before he told his admiral that the blockade that had never in galactic history been broken might currently be, not broken exactly, circumvented, in the most undramatic possible fashion, by small automated containers that his sensors had been processing as asteroid mining equipment. Admiral Thronevath did not take the news well. He took it quietly. That was in many ways worse. The silence of a very powerful entity re-evaluating a situation it had been completely confident about. He reviewed the data himself. He ordered a full sensor audit going back to the first day of the blockade. What the audit revealed was not comfortable viewing. Thousands of pods crossing the perimeter daily, moving through the most heavily defended cordon in the galaxy, on momentum and patience, and the assumption that his doctrine covered everything worth covering. It hadn't. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. "We believe since day 11, sir. The first batches would have begun transit on 11 days. His voice was very controlled. "They began this on day 4. The fabrication orders were placed on day 4. He turned from the display. They read the blockade parameters, identified the sensor threshold, and designed a response within 4 days. His intelligence officer did not respond, because there was nothing to add. Thronevath stood at his window for a long time. Outside it, his fleet hung in its perfect sphere. 2,000 warships, the most powerful blockade ever assembled. And somewhere in the dark between them, hundreds of small containers moved in patient silence, carrying exactly the cargo they needed to carry to the places they needed to carry it, right through the middle of everything he had built. "They're not trying to break the blockade," he said slowly. "They're demonstrating that it doesn't matter." No one replied. "If we increase sensor resolution to cover low-signature objects, it would require retasking 60% of the fleet's processing capacity, sir. And the pods are small enough that at distances below 200 kilometers, we would still face significant false positive." "They designed them that way," Thronevath said. It was not a question. "Almost certainly, yes." He was quiet for a long time. "They want us to know," he said finally. "They want us to find out and understand that we cannot stop it without fundamentally breaking our ability to function as a blockade fleet. This was not just a supply operation. It was a demonstration." He was right. And he knew, with the cold clarity of someone who had just been outthought by a species he had been certain he outclassed, that there was a second problem growing underneath the operational one, because the compact didn't keep secrets well. It was too large, too distributed, too dependent on the cooperative communication networks of 67 member species to maintain tight operational security on something as significant as an ongoing blockade of a major civilization. What Admiral Thronevath had discovered in his intelligence review would not stay in his intelligence review. It would move through the channels and networks and informal exchanges that connected every species in the galaxy, outward and outward until it reached the places that mattered. It reached them in 11 days, which was, in its own way, fitting. The species that heard it first were the small ones, the Tier 4 and Tier 5 civilizations that the Compact had spent decades blockading, coercing, and economically strangling in ways that were technically legal and practically indistinguishable from slow violence. The species that had always calculated the math and found that resistance was impossible, that the Compact's walls were absolute, that the choices available to them were compliance or irrelevance. They heard about Morrow's pods. They heard about asteroid extraction equipment repurposed into supply containers. about 11-day transits below sensor thresholds, about a rear admiral who had sat in the middle of the most powerful blockade ever assembled and spent 4 days figuring out its noise floor. And what they heard was not just a logistics story. What they heard was, the walls are not absolute. The diplomatic consequences arrived before the military ones. 3 compact member species, not the powerful core members but the middle-tier civilizations that had long held quiet resentments about the compact's enforcement practices, filed formal procedural objections to the continued blockade within 48 hours of the story becoming widely known. The objections were legal in nature, citing compact charter provisions on proportional response. By themselves, they would have been manageable. But they came with something attached, the detailed technical specifications of Morrow's pod system, filed as a legal exhibit, illustrating that the blockade's humanitarian impact had been overstated because a workaround existed. The specifications were now in the public compact legal record, available to anyone. Secretary General Diallo watched this unfold from Earth, with the focused attention of someone who had spent 11 years learning how the compact's internal politics actually worked, rather than how they were supposed to work. She had 3 senior legal counselors working around the clock. She had 4 diplomatic communications running simultaneously with compact member species, whose support she had been quietly building for years. She had, it turned out, been building the long game at the same time that Morrow had been running the short one. When the compact's internal council convened an emergency review of the blockade on day 26, she was ready. She didn't go in asking for the blockade to be lifted. She went in presenting evidence. Evidence that the blockade had failed its stated humanitarian threshold, because the colonies it had been designed to pressure had not been deprived of supplies. Evidence that the blockade had failed its legal proportionality test, because 3 independent legal filings by member species had raised the question formally, and the Council was required to address it. Evidence, most devastatingly, that the intelligence failure involved in not detecting the pod operation for 11 days raised serious questions about whether the Enforcement Division was fit to be running a containment measure of this scale. She did not say you failed. She said the mechanism failed. She did not attack the compact. She attacked the specific operation. The distinction was careful and precise and legally significant, and it drove a wedge exactly where she had measured the gap. 3 hours into the council session, the Velthari bloc, already weakened by the fallout from Kepler, declined to vote in favor of continued blockade. 2 swing vote species abstained, which under compact voting rules had the same effect as a no. The resolution to continue the blockade failed by 2 votes. On the unyielding authority, Admiral Thronevoth received the Council's decision at 1600 hours. He spent 4 minutes reviewing it. Then, he issued the stand-down order to his fleet, 2,000 warships, slowly changing their perfect geometry, beginning the long process of dispersal back to their home bases. The ring around the solar system dissolved. It did not dissolve because it was defeated in battle. It dissolved because a woman sitting in a stationary convoy escort ship had spent 4 days doing math. Morrow heard about the blockade's dissolution through the relay network, the same way she had been receiving all news for 26 days, fragmented, time-delayed, reassembled. The message was from Dinesh, who had excellent situational awareness and a gift for brevity. It said, "It's down. You did it." Morrow read it. She was at her desk. She had been at her desk for most of the last 26 days. The spreadsheet was still open. She saved it, closed it, and sat for a moment in the quiet of her cabin. Outside the Arrowhead's hull, the solar system, unblockaded, the familiar stars in their familiar positions, the outer planets going about their ancient business as if 2,000 warships had never surrounded them. She thought about the 11 days, the sensor noise floor calculations, the modified pods moving through 4 billion kilometers of dark space, the governor of Proxima Station at her operations window, looking at a small container that had crossed a galactic blockade on conventional thrusters and patience. She thought about her brother. She had never answered his message. She opened the comm system and started typing. It was short. She was tired, and she had a lot of work still to do. The supply schedule needed to be transitioned back to normal convoy operations. The fabrication orders wound down. The convoy fold drive lockouts formally cleared through UEDC logistics. Her message said, "Sorry I didn't write back. I was busy. Everything's fine. Tell me when you're free for dinner." She sent it. She pulled up the next task file. She started working. In the days after the blockade dissolved, the galaxy processed what had happened in the particular way that major paradigm shifts were always processed. Slowly at first, then all at once, with a great deal of argument about what it actually meant. Military analysts focused on the operational aspects, the sensor threshold calculation, the use of industrial infrastructure as a strategic asset, the use of transit time as a feature rather than a limitation. 3 separate compact member species filed classified requests for the full technical specifications within a week of the pod system's details becoming public record, which was either concerning or, depending on your perspective, encouraging. It meant that other civilizations were thinking about what they could do with the same approach. Diplomatic analysts focused on Diallo's council strategy, the surgical use of legal mechanism and coalition building that had turned an intelligence failure into a political defeat for the enforcement bloc. Seminars on it were being proposed at 3 compact member academies within a month. But what spread furthest, across news relays, through informal communication networks, in the conversations of species who had spent decades telling themselves that the compact's walls were absolute, was simpler than the operational analysis or the legal strategy. It was the image of 3,000 extraction pods. Ordinary, industrial, boring, moving slowly through space. Too small to matter, too common to notice, too patient to stop. Getting through anyway. Not by being stronger than the wall, not by being faster than the wall, by being something the wall hadn't been built to see. On Proxima Station, Governor Osei posted an official account of the supply operation to the station's public record. It was factual and detailed and deliberately unsexy. It described pod dimensions and transit times and cargo manifests and rationing protocols. It read in large stretches like exactly what it was, a logistics report. At the bottom, she had added one line that was not part of the operational record. This station was never in danger of being forgotten. Someone was always working on it, that's worth knowing. On the Arrowhead, Lieutenant Dinesh watched the outer solar system through the observation port as the convoy fold drives received their clearance codes and came back online, one by one, filling the bridge with the familiar hum of drives warming up and a journey resuming. Morrow came onto the bridge as the last clearance came through. She looked at the drive's display, all green, all charged, ready. "Course for the outer colonies," she said. "Standard convoy formation. Full manifest." "Aye, ma'am." Dinesh looked at her. "You know they're going to want to debrief you for weeks." "I know, and there will probably be hearings and reports, and someone will want to name something after you." "Nobody is naming anything after me," Morrow said firmly. "A pod, maybe." "Absolutely not. The Morrow pod has a nice... Plot the course, Dinesh." Dinesh plotted the course, smiling at her station. The Arrowhead began to move, the convoy falling into formation behind it, 14 freighters carrying medical equipment and seed stock and construction materials, and everything else that a civilization moving outward into the dark needed to keep moving. The fold drives built toward jump. The solar system fell behind. Ahead, the outer colonies and the people in them and the work of keeping them alive and connected and part of something larger than themselves. The quiet, unglamorous, absolutely essential work that no military history would ever fully describe because it didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened in spreadsheets at Oro 200 hours. In conversations with governors about rationing adjustments. In navigation code compiled for a small automated pod that needed to travel 4 billion kilometers alone and arrive at exactly the right place. The Arrowhead folded into jump. Around it, the convoy followed, and out there, somewhere in the vast dark between stars, the last of the extraction pods, the ones from the final batches, still in transit when the blockade lifted, continued on their patient trajectories. They didn't know the blockade was gone. They had no sensors, no receivers, no awareness of what had changed. They simply moved, as they had been programmed to move, toward the places they had been sent. They would arrive in 11 days. They would be received, and the people who received them would know, not from a military victory, not from a diplomatic announcement, but from the simple fact of a package arriving, that someone, somewhere, had thought about them carefully enough to make sure they wouldn't be left behind. That was the thing no blockade had ever been built to stop. And no blockade ever would be.